Here's a piece that I wrote that I believe will be relevant to our conversation here. A little extra. Awash with novelty. There was a time when you could wear your grandmother's coat and still be in high fashion. You would hang on to the plow or axe of your grandfather because they no longer made them like they used to. There were, in fact, long periods in history when you would look at the buildings, roads, statues of your forefathers and know they couldn't be made again in your lifetime or many lifetimes to come. Objects would live past people, places remained essentially unaltered for generations. There are also times when the reverse is true. We've been in such an era since the Industrial Revolution, a time when the old is obsolete, the material world reborn again and again, erasing everything in its path. But sometimes time reverses on itself, and a place gets caught up in a loop. I was born in a place like that. You see, the world I grew up in felt borrowed from some forgotten civilization, with us its meek caretakers, leaving but a temporary mark on it. I spent most of my childhood in Cicseredo, a small city in the mountains of Romania, and by the turn of the millennium it felt ancient, more ancient than anything I would read of in history books. Time infused everything. The musty smell of Jules Verne and Jack London, public domain books that the socialist government could print, the screech of rusty metal garages, the gaps in the yellow cobblestone of the central square, the shake of our Trabant, a car made from cardboard from East Germany, as it approached 70 miles an hour, the bumps of potholes, the dust suspended in the afternoon air. I observed the grass that grew in the cracks of the pavement, the undisturbed mold patterns on the ceiling of my grandparents' apartment, the small willows that, somehow, took roots on the roofs of apartment buildings. And I rooted for them because I knew they would eventually overtake everything. I and all who were children in Eastern Europe in the 90s share a kinship, an experience that's difficult to explain. An Italian in the Dark Ages gazing at the crumbling marble of Rome would understand. We were born and lived in the echoes of the Soviet Empire, its material culture falling apart all around us, and it wasn't clear what, if anything else, would follow. How can I explain it to you? Imagine a world where nothing is new. We read books, slept in beds, ate on tables, sat on toilets, opened doors, walked roads, rode on buses, vacationed in hotels, wandered around places that didn't belong to our generation. The few artifacts of our own time, a new TV, a new chair, a microwave, a bottle of Fanta, stuck out among the furnishings of the new, and now old, Soviet man, unwelcome and temporary visitors. Not much was made in the 90s. Already low, GDP per capita tanked in the first decade of the transition in most post-socialist countries. The advent of capitalism made it unclear who owned what, who was responsible for what, who took care of what. Opportunism and corruption were rife, and uncertainty pervaded everything. There was little money to purchase consumer goods, and even less for public works. The infrastructure of the country was barely touched for a decade. Most of Cicseredo was in fact very new. Its residential neighborhoods came from the 70s and 80s. So did the furniture, toys, books, cars, decorations that I grew up with. The electronics and clothes that I wore were a bit newer, but almost always second-hand, either from friends and relatives or brought in from the more affluent West. Every object and place was unique, carried a story of its own. The chess set that I had came with some odd pieces. They were substitutes from a different one. The books I read had other people's names in them. My computers had faded stickers in foreign languages on them. As I rummaged through the drawers of the adults, the emblem of the Socialist Republic of Romania invariably popped up, even on new documents. Though there was little love for the old regime, local government often had no new stationery, so the old stock was used up first. When I first visited Western Europe, and even now, when I pause a bit and I have the eyes to see, I'm stunned by how new everything is. People in new clothes, driving new cars in new streets, going into new buildings with new furniture to live their new lives. London was already a metropolis when Csíkszereda was but a small weekly marketplace at a crossroads, yet the Csíkszereda that I remember is, to me, infinitely more antique. Things turned around with the new millennium in Romania. Economic growth picked up, the new ways settled in. More certainty, more affluence, EU structural funds, remittances, they were starting to impact the landscape of the country. In Csíkszereda too, the cars were replaced, the flats were clad with colorful new insulation and double-pane windows, kitchens were remodeled, new white goods brought in, the relics of socialist factories thrown out. The Central Park and Central Square were redesigned, roads renamed and repaved, buildings that were unfinished for decades finally completed. Having gone to university in a different city, I came home every now and then to a place more and more alien with each visit. I grew up in a rare bubble of time, an almost unnatural one in a post-industrial revolution world. Not that anyone misses it. It was only so because there were no other options. Erasing the remains of socialism was an uplifting experience for those who lived through it. The statues went first, and eventually the living standards followed suit. I don't have much left either. I carried little when I moved to the UK, and got rid of the rest as I embraced minimalism. The pedigree of my possessions is much shorter now. I try to get things used, or mend them, transform them, give them away. But I know that, quite often, I'm just the middleman between China and the landfill. I feel a bit lost. There's a hesitation in my step now. In the dusty turn of the millennium Csíkszereda, I felt part of a story, a thread in the tapestry of time. In a world made up of nothing but the permanent present, it's hard to find your temporal roots. Time to read some history, I guess.